Hello, today we're making chocolate truffles. I'm making a half a recipe from the book. So if we're doing a half a recipe out of the book, there are some things that we're going to need. We're going to need 8 ounces of dark chocolate, 6 ounces of cream, 1 ounce of butter, and a little bit of vanilla. First thing we need to do when we're making chocolate truffles is we need to bring the cream to a full rolling boil. In other words, we want the bubbles to be breaking on the surface very rapidly. We don't want it just a little bit around the outside. We want a full rolling boil. This cream has been somewhat heated already, so it should come to a full rolling boil here pretty quickly. Give it a few minutes. As you can see, it's starting to bubble up quite actively, and there it goes. Now we're ready for the dark chocolate to be put in. The heat from this pot and the cream that's in the pot, the carryover heat, that is going to be enough heat to actually melt the chocolate all the way to make our nice truffle filling. Truffle fillings are nothing more than basically making a somewhat thick ganache. Instead of doing, say, half cream, half chocolate, it's slightly less cream, so it's going to be a little bit on the thicker side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stir this until this becomes somewhat smooth and all the chocolate gets melted. Once the chocolate gets all melted, then we'll add in the butter once it's cooled to a certain extent. Now the butter is at room temperature, so it's somewhat soft already. So it will blend into the truffle filling fairly easily, even though the truffle filling is going to be somewhat cool when we start to add it in. Just keep the filling moving and it will completely melt. Make a nice smooth filling. Now that the filling is somewhat cool, I'm going to go ahead and put the rest of the ingredients in, which is going to be a little splash of vanilla, which is about half a teaspoon. Then we're going to put in the butter, and then we're just going to stir this until the butter has been incorporated into the chocolate. This is going to give it a nice rich flavor, as if chocolate doesn't need any more richness along with the cream. This just kind of helps make it a little bit more on the smoother side. Once I get this made, I'm basically going to put it into a bowl, cover it with plastic where the plastic is touching it, and just leave it at room temperature. This truffle filling is basically going to be ready to be scooped in about 4 or 5 hours.
Now that our truffle chocolate has set at least overnight to kind of firm up just a little bit, instead of doing the method in the book where they say pipe it, I kind of like to go ahead and scoop my truffles out. That way I can a little bit better control the size of the truffles that I'm making. This scoop that I'm using for scooping these truffles happens to be a 100 scoop, which is a very small scoop, but it's a pretty good size for a truffle. Once I get them all scooped out, I'm going to round them a little bit to make sure they're a little bit more round. Then I'm going to put them in the refrigerator just to get them to firm up just a little bit before I dip them in tempered chocolate. Okay, I've gone ahead and rounded most of these truffles, but just in case you need to see this, when you're rounding truffles, generally I'll have a pair of gloves on, and don't keep that ganache in your hand for a long period of time, or you'll start to actually melt the chocolate even worse than it already is. But these look nicely rounded, so they're pretty much so ready to go, so I'm going to put those into the refrigerator when I go to temper my chocolate. Now, in tempering chocolate, every chocolate has its own temperature. This happens to be Peter's chocolate. Peter's chocolate, I know the high point is like 120 degrees. The low point is 88, and then its working temperature is 91 degrees. So to make it a little simpler, I'm simply going to melt this chocolate to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm going to then use the seeding method. In other words, I'm going to take a block of chocolate and I'm going to put it into my chocolate that I have chopped up, and I'm going to mix this around until the temperature reaches 91 degrees. At that point, it should be ready and should be perfectly tempered, and we can go ahead and start rolling the truffles in the tempered chocolate and get them to set very nicely. But the seeding method is just one method of tempering chocolate. So to get started, I have my chocolate chopped up fairly fine. I'm going to put it over a pot of simmering water. It doesn't have to be boiling. Generally speaking, I will bring the water to a boil, turn it down to a simmer, and just slowly start melting the chocolate. Now, when you're melting chocolate, this seems like it takes forever, but it will melt, and it's very important that you stir it in one direction. It sounds like an old wives' tale about chocolate, but it actually keeps all the crystals in line, so it actually works to your advantage to stir it only in one direction. Try not to incorporate too much air into the chocolate while you're stirring it, but that is the whole purpose of this. So I'm going to be stirring this until it gets melted and it reaches a temperature of 120 degrees. Occasionally I have to take it off the heat, let the chocolate melt a little more, and then bring it back to the heat because I never want to bring it above that 120 degrees Fahrenheit.
Go.
Okay, I've gone ahead and melted this chocolate to 120 degrees. For Peter's chocolate, it is 120. So the method I'm going to be using for tempering the chocolate is a block seeding method. As you can see right now, the chocolate flows fairly readily and fairly thin. When we get this seeding chocolate in there and we bring it down to a temperature of 91 degrees, you're going to see that the chocolate has thickened up quite a bit, and it's actually going to you can actually tell that it's actually gotten a little bit more body behind it. So right now I'm just going to stir this small piece of chocolate into my main melted chocolate just until the temperature reaches its working temperature, which is 91 degrees Fahrenheit for the Peter's chocolate. So all I'm doing is just kind of moving the seed around. How it exactly seeds is that the chocolate that I put in there as the main block still is in perfect temper. In other words, all the crystals of the cocoa butter are in perfect alignment. They have all set up nicely together. So when you add these to your melted chocolate, which you have knocked out of temper, as this cools, those crystals that are in the chocolate that is still tempered are going to help bring the rest of the chocolate crystals together to where they will come together and set very quickly and all stay in a nice alignment without blooming. The bloom is basically any whitish coating that forms on the outside of your chocolate once it has set. This chocolate now, the seed has been in there and it's gotten quite a bit smaller. At this time it has reached about 91 degrees, which is the perfect working temperature for the Peter's chocolate. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to remove this seed and put it on some plastic for now and move it out of my way. This chocolate pretty much has been tempered. It is ready to go. Now my method for dipping truffles is kind of a messy method. It works for me. It doesn't always work for all people, but it's one method you can actually do. And generally what I do is I take a little bit of their chocolate. As you can see, it's quite a bit thicker. I put some in the palm of my hand. I'll pick up a truffle, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to roll this truffle around very gently in the chocolate. And then when I put it on the sheet pan, set it down, grab the next truffle. And it can be a little bit of a messy process, so if you want to cover your table with some parchment paper, some plastic wrap, what have you, that keeps it a little neater, but still it's going to be a little bit of a messy process. You can do this with the dipping forks, and they seem to work very well for a lot of people. I just don't have any right now, but right now this seems to work out pretty good for me, and this is a pretty good method for dipping your truffles. Now truffles, even if they're not perfectly round, that could be okay, because the chocolate truffles were actually named after the truffles that are used in the kitchen, meaning those big, ugly, black things. They're kind of like they're a fungus, but they come in all kinds of odd shapes, and that's what the chocolate truffles were actually named after. So if they're not exactly perfect, that's okay. The perfect truffles generally are done using a molding process. And if you want to do the molding process, a lot of times they call those bonbons too. But for the most part, these are perfectly fine, and you can call these hand-dipped truffles and probably charge a little extra money for them. Okay, I've gone ahead and finished dipping all the truffles. As you can see, some of the truffles have started to dull up. As the truffles start to dull up like that, that means that the chocolate has set. Where they're still kind of shiny, the chocolate hasn't completely set yet. Now, the one thing I did forget to tell you before we started dipping the truffles, a quick, simple test of checking the temper on your chocolate is taking a small piece of paper, putting it in the freezer, dipping it in chocolate, putting it in the freezer for a minute or two just to see if it'll set. If it melts immediately when you put your finger on it, it's not tempered. But as you can see, this piece of chocolate here that I've touched, leave my finger on it for quite a while, it didn't really melt that much or melt at all. So the chocolate is tempered. Now, to store the chocolate, once I have used chocolate, I generally will take a bowl and I'll line it with plastic. I'll try to keep most of the folds out of the plastic, and I'll go ahead and put the chocolate in that plastic wrap that is in a bowl. And what this does, this gives you a way to actually pull the chocolate out, peel the plastic off, and then actually chop that chocolate up again and use it for either retempering, making more truffles, or using in any recipe that you have.